Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a little chat about the three stupidest, least effective codas ever written by major composers. Now, you know what a coda is, right? And a coda means tail. It's the ending of a movement or a large work. And codas can be quite difficult. Endings are difficult. Some composers had real problems with endings. They had to keep adjusting them to try and find the right ending. You know, they say that when you're on a jet, when you're on a plane and you're flying, the most dangerous points in the flight are takeoffs and landings. And it's exactly the same thing with a piece of music. Getting it started and then stopping it are the biggest problems, or two of the biggest problems, among the biggest problems that a composer faces aesthetically. And a lot of composers, even very great ones, have a lot of difficulties with just those issues. How many pieces do you know that sort of start out snoozy, and then once they get going, everything's fine? Or they're going like gangbusters, but that ending just doesn't cut it. And even if the work is an acknowledged work of genius, that doesn't mean it's perfect in all of its parts. Some bits are great, some bits are less great. Audiences back in the day, they didn't have any conception of large-scale form the way we talk about form, the way I talk about form, sonata form and wholeness and all that stuff. All of that folderol was a result of sort of early 20th century philosophical doublespeak. It really was. And it wound up, I think, making some wonderful revelations about the way we listen to music. But if you read reviews of music, for example, in the 19th century, I remember reading about early performances of Brahms' First Symphony, where people said, well, they liked the first tune and they didn't like the second tune. And that's the way critics wrote. The first theme is very lovely. The second theme, less so. The next passage is ugly. Even people like Clara Schumann, for example, writing to Brahms and things like that, would say, well, I didn't like this bit and I liked that bit. They weren't concerned with whether the entire thing has its own organic shape and every part is a necessity. They kind of thought that you could jettison the dull bits and keep the good ones or make cuts. Some of that tradition is still with us. It's still with us, for example, in Russian performances when Timurkhanov does Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony live. He cuts the living daylights out of it. Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony, Tchaikovsky's Fifth, the finale. We see these things, these remnants of that tradition, the tradition that you don't have to do things whole. You can get rid of the dull bits. You can try and tidy up the imperfections. And so it is with codas. And so I am here to propose three of the very worst codas ever emitted by a major composer. And the first one is really kind of a fun case because I have talked about it before, but I want to consider it for a moment in isolation because it's a really funny case. We're talking about the original ending to the first movement of the Eighth Symphony by Bruckner. Yes, Bruckner's Eighth Symphony. It is absolutely ineffective in its first version because the first movement, it's in C minor, it's very tragic. And it comes to a volcanic, tragic climax, an ultimate collapse, which on revision, Bruckner realized was the only appropriate ending. Not just because it's perfect as an ending to the first movement, that it should end quietly and in darkness. The only first movement by Bruckner that does that, by the way. But also because he's going to bring this main theme back at the very end of the symphony as part of this gargantuan coda that incorporates the themes of all four movements. And it's a magnificent culmination to a symphony which is a finale symphony. That is, the main movement, the weight of the symphonic argument is shifted to the finale. So you don't want to have a huge, triumphant C major climax at the end of the dark, tragic C minor first movement because that's coming later. Bruckner finally figured this out, and he got rid of the horrible, awful, stupid, pointless, ridiculous coda to the end of his first movement. But of course, the Bruckner people decided that they should publish the original version of the symphony in its own critical edition, and that puts the coda back. So it's there, and it's getting played, and I wouldn't even be talking about this thing had it not been for the fact that these idiots decided that we needed to hear Bruckner's appallingly awful original thoughts. So here they are. I play a little bit of the music that would eventually end the movement, and then the coda as it erupts, which I think, did in my discussion of Bruckner's Eighth Symphony, but it never hurts to do it again because I just am dazzled at the foolishness of this. This is the Georg Tintner recording on Naxos, which is quite splendid, and there's nothing better than a splendid performance of an appallingly stupid bit of music. Here it is. Awful, horrendous, completely pointless. And even if you could make the argument that a big C major coda to the end of the movement is sort of somehow appropriate, I don't know why anyone would make that argument. This is such a bad coda. It's one of those, it just perorates. But it doesn't do anything. I mean, it doesn't have any purpose. It doesn't develop anything. It doesn't seem the logical outcome of anything. It's just a giant lump of brassy noise, a la Bruckner. Maybe somebody should do it separately. You could make it like the theme song for something. I don't know. I mean, Bruckner did write it. Maybe someone wants to use it for some sort of movie something or fanfare thing. But boy, what a terrible coda. That's the first one. The next one is the ending of Richard Strauss's Ein Heldenleben. Now, Ein Heldenleben, I mean, Strauss's tone poems, Strauss's music generally, of all the major composers, I think he probably had the worst sense of timing musically. I mean, it has to do, of course, with his overall sense of form, because most of his pieces end quietly, and most of them end quietly anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes later than they should have ended. And the real case in point is Ein Heldenleben, because Ein Heldenleben, you know, it's got the hero and then the critics and then his girlfriend and then the love scene and then the battle, and he wins the battle, and that's where it should stop. It has no reason to continue, but it's Strauss, and he has to have some sort of philosophical pretension, and victory is not good enough. Then there is the hero's works of peace, which is a recipe for tedium. And in this particular case, the hero's works of peace are Strauss's own greatest hits up to that point, which was 1898. And we get to hear little bits of all the other stuff he wrote around the same time and before. some of which doesn't get performed anymore. So fortunately, we don't have to know what all of it is. But then comes his retreat from the world and his revulsion at all materialistic and worldly things, and his final death with his girlfriend at his bedside. She's the violin, sweetly and serenely singing above, seraphically. And as her seraphicness gets ever more evanescent, the music just evaporates into nothingness a good 15 minutes after it should have stopped. And very few people disagree with that proposition, I might add. Some people might say, well, it's got some pretty music, it's not so bad, blah, blah. But the truth of the matter is, it goes on too long. It just does. And in this particular case, Strauss originally ended it there. But even he was dissatisfied with the ending of just a seraphic high violin and a little pizzicato, and then this whole massive thing is over. The original ending has been recorded. Savalas did it, for example, in his recording with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and proved definitively that the original ending was absolutely awful. And so Strauss added a coda to his coda. Because remember, the last 15 minutes of the thing is basically coda. Everything after the victory is inessential and is finding a way to finally drag its heaving and exhausted carcass over the finish line. And so when we get to the very end, by the time we get to the very end and it's finally over, here comes the coda to the coda. Now, the coda to the coda is a big brass crescendo. I mean, that's all it is. It's a big crescendo of the brass, like a little chorale, and then a final E-flat major chord that then fades away and ends quietly. Now, if it were going to end triumphantly, you could argue the coda would be okay. But since Strauss already has ended quietly in E-flat major, why do it again just to end quietly again in E-flat major? It's just an absolutely useless minute of music. And here, beautifully performed by Franz Xavier Roth and the SWR Symphony Orchestra of Baden-Baden and Freiburg on Hänssler, is the coda to the coda that nobody needs. Awful, isn't it? It's just droopy and you're dying. It's awful. You wish it would stop. And then, oh God, here it comes again. Oh my, is something else going to happen? No, nothing happens. It all just fades out and absolutely, completely pointlessly. But you understand why Strauss felt he had to do it, because it was so boring up to that point. He needed one last convulsion to just wake people up and try and provide an ending that was somehow adequate to the size and ambition of all of the exciting and interesting music that had come before, none of which we've heard for the past 15 minutes. It's really extraordinarily bad. And just to show you how bad it is, here is an example of almost exactly the same thing, but by a composer who knew what he was doing, who really knew what he was doing. I'm talking about the ending of the Dvorak cello concerto, which was written about 5 years earlier. Because there, you've got a finale, and the finale is vigorous and exciting, and it's a march tune, and then it all settles down to a series of melodic, very introspective, rhapsodic, lyrical afterthoughts, one after the other, that are beautiful and mellifluous and gently recalling the themes of the previous movements, just as Strauss does. And it all seems to be passing into oblivion, just as Strauss does. But then suddenly the orchestra revives for the triumphant ending. But it's a triumphant ending, and it's fast, and it's exciting, and it sounds fabulous. It's just fabulous. It's absolutely right in its context, because it does, in fact, sum up, in a sense, all that we've heard before, and puts the seal on a work which has a certain size and grandeur, and so needs to finish in a way that's commensurate with the ambition of the composer, unlike Ein Heldenleben. So this is the Supraphon recording, and it's just a very good recording with Milos Sadlo cello. And it's beautiful. And here is just the ending with a little lyrical stuff beforehand of the Dvorak cello concerto. And this tells you exactly how right it is and how to do this sort of thing correctly. Strauss could have learned a thing or two. Finally, and this one's going to cause some controversy, but that's part of the fun, isn't it? My nomination for worst coda of all time goes to the Coda to the Eroica Symphony. I mean, this is really terrible, because Beethoven is figuring out how to do one of these sort of big romantic wind-ups of the type he would do at the end of the Leonora Overture No. 3 or the Fifth Symphony. Or, he wrote these big, endless codas that go on and on and on. And this is his first one, and it's really not his best. Not at all. Why? Well, once again, first of all, the movement seems to be conking out into nothingness, which is in and of itself is perfectly fine, because the harmony is mysterious, and unlike with Strauss, it can't actually stop before the coda erupts. I mean, something else has got to happen. So Beethoven doesn't run that risk. The problem is that the coda itself, which begins with a recollection of the very opening of the finale, starts to try and find ways to come to a conclusion. And it does it very crudely, in every possible way. It repeats itself too frequently. It's terribly scored. I mean, the orchestration is really ineffective. Why? Because the brass instruments aren't capable of playing all the notes that they evidently want to. The woodwinds have a little scale up at the end when they go do 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 do. Remember that? You almost never hear it. And if you do hear it, it sounds feeble. And then you've got like pounding timpani and these string chords. Bum, 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 I mean, forget Beethoven wrote it. If anyone else had written it, wouldn't you just be sitting around saying, isn't that stupid? I mean, doesn't that just sound wrong? It's especially wrong when you hear it on period instruments because it sounds so staccato. I mean, everything is clipped and cut short. It's just eek, eek. And in addition to sounding just insubstantial and badly scored, for some reason it always sounds out of tune. I don't know why. Maybe somebody can explain that. And not out of tune in the brass. Usually it's those string chords and things. It doesn't have time to make the harmony feel like it's right, like it's present. I don't know how else to describe it. All I know is that it's enormously unsatisfying, and the result is that different performances of it have tried many, many different things. Probably the best one is Zell, because Zell is, first of all, he's very quick, but also he rescores a lot of it so that the brass can play what the brass are supposed to play, and he also knows what to do with those staccato chords to let them sound and resonate. On period instruments, they never resonate. On modern instruments, they can resonate. And then there's the question of what to do with the very last chord of the symphony. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. Bwah, bwah, is what Beethoven wrote. It's a pretty short staccato chord. Smart people hold on to it a little bit longer because it just gives you more of a sense of finality. So I'm going to play you two different versions of it because it's fun. Here is Blomstedt with the Staatskapelle Dresden. It's a very good version. It's the big band version where he's doing his best to try and create a full sound and a full texture. And he largely succeeds. It's pretty good. It really is, even though the music is fighting it. Here is one way to do it. And then there is the period influence style type version. And here is Adam Fischer with the Danish Chamber Orchestra on Naxos. Now, this is much faster, which is smart. When you're dealing with a pint-sized orchestra, you don't want to linger. You don't want to try and let them play notes for longer than they have any business attempting, because you'll know right away that it's a pint-sized orchestra. They don't have the weight of sonority. So that's a smart thing. But you can also hear just the way that the whole thing comes off. It's very light and very ineffectual, but for what it is, it's well done. It's the music itself that is causing the problem. It really is. So here's the other way to do it, basically. Neither of them are very good. Not because the performances aren't, but because Beethoven isn't. This is a great symphony, a major statement, obviously. But after the grand first two movements and that really revolutionary miracle of a scherzo, the finale, I find, is something of a letdown. It really is. And this coda is, I think, one of Beethoven's grandest lapses. I just feel that way. And you, of course, are free to disagree and to express your disagreement in the comments section. I think this is a really, really bad coda of a type that Beethoven would soon master. And the fact that it's such a bad coda, I think, is proven by the fact that he wrote these other fabulous codas to the Leonore Overture, to the Fifth Symphony, like we talked about, to the finale of the Seventh. I mean, he was such a master at finding just the right conclusion, but he hadn't figured it out yet for a work on this scale, of this size, of this ambition. He doesn't have the problem in the First or Second Symphonies. And they have very large codas, some of those movements. They really do. But he understands the scale on which he's working. Here, he's working on a much bigger scale, and he knows he has to do something that's commensurate with that scale, and he hasn't figured it out yet. That in itself could be fascinating. It really could. But good coda, appropriate coda, rewarding and satisfying coda? Nah. It's a dud. Anyway, those are just three. There are many, many, many more bad codas that we could talk about, and maybe we will. You may have some suggestions for me. Feel free to let me know which terrible endings you think are the worst out there, and maybe we'll play some of those too. I think that it's good to question. It's good to challenge the conceived opinion of these works as, imperishable masterpieces of which contain not a single blemish. Everything has a blemish. We're all blemished. It's only human. It's okay. The point is to understand what the blemishes are and understand whether or not they matter, and to have a good conversation about it and enjoy the music because of that. I think that's really part of the point, too. It's just one of the reasons that we keep on listening. So thank you for joining me. Take care.